First of all, I would like to thank you guys for coming. Thank everyone else for coming. So we're doing this talk in the context of a show here at Zephyr called Sweet Home. It has 7 Kentucky artists dealing with the dynamic of producing work, A, in this region, and B, that the work that deals with dynamics of labor. Wherever we're talking about craft, wherever we're talking about fine art market, or in some cases, and especially the way that we arrange the show, it deals with also with the industrially produced object. So Will and Colleen, 2 artists in the show, will kind of talk today about ideas of labor and time, very often in the context of industrial economy especially. It's a pretty straightforward, almost arithmetical type of relationship. So most of the time we divide labor by the amount of time that it took to produce the said labor. We get the efficiency of the workforce, and therefore can try to figure out how to shape our production pipeline in accordance with this fairly simplistic type of relationship. However, in the post-industrial economies, what is very interesting is that, in a sense, these 2 ideas are decoupled. We can have various different narratives influencing both of these concepts, and furthermore influencing the marketplaces that are driven by these ideas. So what's really interesting in the context of an art show, especially in an art show that is in a gallery that used to be a house, that is now repopulated with furniture and various other pieces. Like, for example, we have Dan Chaffin furniture makers producing this specific bench plus table set. We have Harper scaffolding series that deals with J.C. Penney's home collection. So porcelain that is oven and freezer safe, dishwasher and microwave safe, made in China for your home enjoyment, right? So in these specific contexts, in a sense, the little cloister of the art world that gallery can function as allows us fairly free conversations, and perhaps really playful conversations around the narratives that shape our consumption. So A, we have objects that are very much in the craft marketplace, have craft narratives attached to them. B, we have objects that are very much in terms of this J.C. Penney home collection, very much in the industrial production marketplace, and then an artist comes in and starts sort of deterritorializing these objects and moving them in the space of quote-unquote fine arts production, with all the things that are attached to that quote-unquote, right? So what we can start exploring here is really what kind of narratives, right? I've said narrative maybe 5 or 6 times already, but what kind of narratives do we attach to these concepts, and how does it relate to the work that you guys are producing, and how can it signal certain things outside of the art world cloister, right? So first I wanted to go to Will and talk specifically about this idea of time, right? So maybe there's a more nuanced kind of relationship between time and labor, and specifically how does time influence narratives of labor?
So to answer that, I would first unpack what we mean when we talk about time. And specifically in an industrial or post-industrial context, we're speaking of time in terms of the clock, which is an invention that corresponds with the first assembly lines, also designed the first clocks. And this is a way that labor was managed and quantified into abstract measures of time. Before, time would exist in felt relation to daily activities. You might measure time in a rice cooking, or a frying a locust is a unit of time. But in an industrial labor market, time exists as this abstraction. And what happens is this time calculus begins to affect the way that we perceive our internal time, the time of domesticity, and also our expectations of how time should be used, the utility of time. So time management starts to exist. And we think about how long an activity should happen, and then efficiency starts to be managed by these. What happens is there comes a kind of tunnel vision in the way that we perceive utility in labor. We start to become overly focused on a specific outcome, and that all activity has to be guided toward that outcome. And then our effectiveness in that activity or in that labor is measured by how quickly we get to that outcome. And so, my work, I want to investigate how we might perceive of time in a different way, or in a way that efficiency is more related to how labor affects the other activities that are going on around it. Like in a domestic sphere, you're multitasking, like you're constantly juggling between different things, and what you do over here affects what happens over here. And there's never this kind of assembly line labor situation where you're just doing one thing and nothing else is affected by it. So I'm interested in cyclical time and time relations that are more open.
So when we're talking about cyclical time, and like for example, like what would be pre-industrial types of examples of cyclical time?
Agricultural rhythms, planting, harvesting, the generational cycles, family cycles, communal festivals and customs. So, the work I've shown is this collection of foraged mushrooms found in Louisville and in my home in Rockcastle County. And what's interesting about mushrooms is these micro-seasonal moments that you get, like where certain species appear and disappear. And, so there's a different way of looking at time.
Different ways of relating to time. And I think what's really interesting, and in many ways, there is a danger of sort of this nostalgia entering into the work, but we do live in a time where the cycle that defines a lot of the work is the cycle of production, the cycle of shipping, the cycle of dissemination to the store, and there is no clear relation to the maker. So just to throw a little bit of a nuance there and talk about the craft tradition and how it's recast in a more contemporary climate, just wanted to get your opinion, Colleen, about this specific, fairly contemporary shift, right?
Yeah, I'll use quilt making as an example because that's what I'm doing. My works are created from manipulated quilts. Is that, so if you look at the history of quilt making as a craft-based time, it was a way to take up time, it started as that. People would collect fabric from their homes. They would get together and they would create patterns that had some sort of religious meaning or often like spiritual meaning, the way that the fabric was placed within the space. Then women, mostly women, would get together, sit around, and they would have a process where they are working on the quilts together. So a group may work on one quilt that goes to one family, and then that quilt is used as, a literal quilt, as something that will comfort someone. But the whole process of getting to that is very much, has deeper meaning than just the literal quilt of what a quilt is. So it's a way to empower those people who are together. Women are talking to each other. I mean, quilt making, quilting bees started like the suffrage movement is an example of how it created people talking and created people to go much beyond the idea of making a quilt. So that's where the history of quilt making came from. So now, if you were to look at quilt making as a craft pastime, it's much more, it's marketed. So the experience is marketed. The idea that, okay, if I want to create a quilt, what do I do? So nowadays, instead of collecting like the fabric from your home, old sheets, old clothes, old like feed sacks, that kind of thing, you go to like a Johann Fabrics, which is a chain store. You buy commercial fabric that's created, probably mostly made in China, and that fabric is then arranged into a pattern that's already created for you. So that's probably, it's like a kit. They call it like a quilting kit, and it's all figured out for you. And I think that kind of feeds to society. We really want to have, our attention span is very short. So if we're going to do a craft pastime now, we're going to want to have it kind of immediate. We're going to want to have that immediate gratification. So kits, like quilting kits, feed that. So you could buy a kit, you can arrange the fabric, you can make a quilt, and yes, you have a quilt. But then you lose a lot of what interests me about quilt making and the history of quilt making is that it was a way to bring people together, to empower them, for them to talk. And then also, there's a lot of significance that's connected to the way that patterns are arranged. Lots of, not just religious, but like quilt patterns, for example, would have like a religious affiliation like in the title. Also, it would be like ways that women could express themselves kind of secretly. So we kind of lose that in that transition to modern day like craft process. And that's happening in all types of hands-on craft processes. It's not just quilt making.
It's really interesting in terms of sort of craft processes. It's almost rebranding of the craft process.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe a little bit of how it's actually done in a chain store?
How if you were to make like a craft object?
Yeah, because no one is going to come out and basically advertise the fact like, hey, made in China, quilt product, made right for you. Can be done in 5 minutes or less, right? So what is that sort of like almost like marketing trapping of the contemporary?
Well, I think the marketing markets the experience of like this nostalgic experience of like, okay, quilt making or embroidery or any kind of craft process, even woodwork, something pottery, that is known as a very nostalgic type of pastime or nostalgic way of doing. So I think they feed that in a way. They try to get someone interested in creating a quilt because of that. They may think of like, oh, well, when I was growing up, I had a quilt in my home, or they relate a quilt to their history. So I think that's one way of marketing it. And then another way is again the easy access and the easy creation of it. You are literally given a pattern, you follow that pattern, you buy these commercial fabrics, you follow what the fabrics tell you to do, and you get it done in a day. Before quilt making, a quilt could take up to a month, and all different people would sit and work on it together. So again, it takes out that social aspect as well. It's much more individualized. It's much more just one person creates it. So that kind of is a major transition too in how marketing and